Welcome to episode 346 of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to, once again, retired agent David Gates, who served in the FBI for 21 years. In this episode, he reviews the investigation of the November 2013 active shooter incident at Terminal 3 at the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX. The shooting rampage resulted in the line-of-duty murder of Transportation Security Administration TSA Officer Gerardo Hernandez. 2 other TSA officers were wounded along with the passenger. The gunman pleaded guilty to the murder and 10 other criminal counts. He was sentenced to life plus 60 years in prison without parole. This episode is dedicated to TSA Officer Gerardo Hernandez. David Gates spent most of his bureau career assigned to LAX. When he retired, he was one of the FBI's experts in crimes on board aircraft. Before joining the FBI, he spent 7 years with the United States Customs Service working at LAX. And within a year of graduating from the FBI Academy, he was transferred to work at the FBI's satellite office at LAX, where he served for 20 years, during which David worked on hundreds of investigations involving crimes on board aircraft and federal crimes at airports. Since retiring from the FBI, yes, that's right, he's still working at LAX. Before we get to the case review, I want to say a few things. Now, I try my best to keep this podcast a safe place from politics, but there's been a lot going on in the last few weeks, so I would be disingenuous to say that I support the FBI and not comment on the actions of current Department of Justice officials in regards to FBI employees who investigated January 6 cases. I write about this in my February email to Reader Team members and suggest ways that you can make your voices heard. But on this platform, I want to reach out to active agents and analysts and say that my thoughts and prayers are with you. This must be so demoralizing, but I hope I can speak for the thousands of people who listen to this show. We support you. I want to welcome new listeners. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to join my reader team, where I talk about crime fiction, and you can learn about the FBI in books, TV, and movies. There are also links to where you can buy me a cup of coffee and discover my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books, available as ebooks and paperbacks wherever books are sold, and audiobooks on Audible and Spotify. Thank you for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest back again, retired agent David Gates. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, well, I had to have you back because we weren't done yet. We were still talking about all the work that you did as an agent and supervisor at the Los Angeles International Airport, LAX office of the FBI. Our last episode was episode 340, where you talked about sexual assault on board aircraft. And I'm telling you, that episode blew up. I got so many comments and emails about it. People were first surprised that the FBI had anything to do with investigating crimes on aircraft. And one of those crimes was sexual assault. I'm telling you, it was the perfect episode to be posted just before the holiday travel. So bravo to you.
Well, thank you. I will say that in that little intro there, the only thing I'm concerned about is you using the phrase blow up.
Yeah, that was the wrong choice of words.
It was lovely, though. I get it.
All right.
I have to have my fun.
There's so much more, though. And we talked about the fact that the office in the Los Angeles airport was really like a tiny field division because you worked everything basically that the FBI works in that small little office space at the airport.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, we certainly have primary jurisdiction for crimes aboard aircraft and some federal crimes at the airport. But think about it this way. From an agent perspective, if you aren't tracking your fugitive, your spy, your terrorist, your white collar criminal globally, then pretty much you've failed in this day and age. Everyone travels, and LAX, where I worked, was one of the biggest and busiest airports in the world. Every day was emails and phone calls of agents and other law enforcement asking for help with their targets, their subjects, their witnesses, something. Everything goes through the airport.
There's so many things we could talk about today that I thought were fascinating. And at first, I was going to call this episode Guns, Drugs, and Lasers. But I don't think we're going to have time to get into all of that. So maybe I'll have you come back to talk about drug smuggling and laser attacks that are done from the ground to aircraft. But let's concentrate today on shooting incidents that occur at the airport because you've had several at LAX that you were directly involved in the investigation.
Well, really, one that I was intimately involved in the investigation, and that was the 2013 one. There was one in 2002 where I was a U.S. Customs Service supervisor. I wasn't part of the FBI, but I was involved in it to a peripheral extent. And then when I joined the FBI's LAX team, I got more involved and learned a lot about it and put some presentations together. And then we also had an active shooter scare a few years ago. People in the know call it the Zorro incident. And if we have time, maybe we can talk about that a little bit. But I think the one that most people are familiar with is the 2013 active shooter at LAX, which killed a TSA officer.
All right, yeah, let's do that one first. I have a few articles that I will put in the show notes about this one too. Where do you want to start?
Where I'd like to start first on this is a reminder to your listeners that Officer Hernandez, Gerardo Hernandez, was murdered, and he was the first and to this day only TSA officer killed in the line of duty. Even over a decade after this happened, it is a raw and emotional incident for the TSA. So I want to just take a moment at the very top of the program to acknowledge that we lost a federal officer here. And it was a very emotional, troubling event. This was a really, really good guy. He was a good officer. He was a family man. This was very much a senseless act of violence. Officer Hernandez is what I really want to start the show with, and remembering him and his life.
Another thing that I'll do is in the show notes, I will have a link to a page dedicated to Officer Hernandez so people can learn more about him.
Great. Thank you. And I guess we'll start off I'll try to go through the incident and then maybe the FBI's involvement and some of the things we learned. But to start the scene, this is November 1st, 2013. It's a Friday morning. It's the day after Halloween. In general, in the United States, Halloween and the day after really are partial holidays. There's a lot of festivities and whatnot, but it's Friday morning. This happened at about 9:20 in the morning. So a lot of people are traveling out of LAX to start their long weekend. And this happened at Terminal 3. And for people who aren't familiar with LAX, to get into LAX, it's like a giant horseshoe. You start on the right side of the horseshoe. You have terminals 1, 2, and 3, then the Bradley terminal, then 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8, and a giant loop around this horseshoe. So this happened at Terminal 3, and at the time, Terminal 3 was Virgin America and Alaska Airlines and a couple smaller airlines. The FBI office at LAX at that time was at Terminal 3. Our office is about 50 yards from where the shooting happened, and we'll talk about that more later. But what happened that morning is that about 9:20 a.m., the shooter, a young man named Paul Ciancia, was dropped off at the airport by a roommate, and he walked in, and there was no line at the time because this is about 9:20 in the morning, and most of the early flights had taken off, and there was some traffic, but it's not the 6 a.m. crush of people. It's LAX, it's still busy. Maybe I should back up a little bit here too. When you are approaching the TSA checkpoint, there's an escalator and stairs up to where TSA is. And then the terminal is set up almost like if you had a lollipop, where it's a very long corridor, like the stick of a lollipop. And then the terminal had a circular hub. So you walk down a long terminal and there's a bunch of gates along a giant circle. If you think of a lollipop, that's how the terminal sort of looked like. At the very tip of the lollipop and the stem is where TSA was.
And is this the part where they're checking for your identification and passports, and then you are putting your suitcase to go through the magnetometer?
At this time, what happened was Officer Hernandez was at the TSA podium downstairs. TSA was directly above him. And so he was the one at this escalator making sure that you had your passport and boarding pass and only ticketed passengers would go through. He's basically your first line of defense. It's the non-sterile area. He was talking and joking with a couple and smiling and laughing. Ciancia was behind him in basically a queue that a bunch of stanchions were set up for a line. There was no one in line. He set down his carry-on bag. He pulled out an assault rifle. He aimed it at Officer Hernandez. And about 1 to 2 seconds before the first shot rang out, there was a young worker who saw what was going on and pointed. And as soon as she pointed, Mr. Ciancia opened fire. Officer Hernandez had his back to the shooter, didn't see him, and was smiling and laughing with a couple the moment he was shot. He took several bullets. Several people around ran away. Ciancia then started up the escalator with his gun. It was basically like a march at this point. He wasn't running. He wasn't going slow. It was just a determined march. When he was about 4 or 5 steps up the escalator, he looked back at Officer Hernandez. Officer Hernandez slumped at that moment in time. He had fallen from his chair against the wall. Ciancia looked at him. Hernandez slumped, and Ciancia ran down the escalator the wrong way, and at point-blank range fired multiple additional shots into Officer Hernandez.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it was a brutal video to watch. After doing that, he went up the escalator, again at a slow march, and TSA then was right in front of you, and to the left there's usually an exit lane. In most airports, you'll see an exit lane to the left, and at Terminal 3 there was an exit lane to the left. He went the left-hand route, and there was a room back there. It was like a break room for TSA. And he walked inside, and there were a bunch of passengers who had taken shelter in there. And he pointed his gun and asked them, "Are you with TSA?" And they said no. He did not shoot them. He turned out of the room, kept walking through the exit lane. And at the end of the exit lane, he basically, like again, to the lollipop analogy, there's about 40 or 50 yards of a straight passageway. And in the distance, he saw that telltale dark blue TSA uniform running away from him. And he opened fire. He ended up shooting 2 more TSA officers and one of the passengers. The officers were Officer Spear and Officer Grigsby, and the passenger was a school teacher who lived north of LA at the time. After he did that, he reloaded, which took a bit of time. He was using an assault rifle that had a little key, so he had to unlock it, put the magazine back in, and it took 20 or 30 seconds to do that. And then he jogged down the terminal, the straightaway from the terminal. At the end of the terminal where that lollipop sphere is, he went to the left where there are a bunch of gates of waiting planes. And then he cut through the middle and he went to the right side of the terminal looking for more TSA officers. He did not find any. By that time, he had been in the terminal for about 2.5 minutes, maybe. That was when the first police officers arrived on scene. They went down the corridor looking for him. They engaged him at the top of Terminal 3. They shot at him several times. They missed. The officers fanned out and took cover behind pillars. One of them moved forward behind the Virgin America check-in desk, and one of the officers shot Ciancia in the face, dropping him instantly. But the shot actually did not hit anything vital. It blew out a bunch of his teeth, and part of Ciancia's tongue was shot out, and it dropped him like a load of bricks immediately. The officers approached, handcuffed him, called for help, and they asked a few fire life safety questions like they should do, like, are you alone? Is there anyone else? Things like that. Then he was taken to the hospital, and that's about the time I got my first email saying something was wrong. So the entire incident from the first shot until he was dropped and handcuffed was under 6 minutes. It's probably about 4.5 to 5 minutes in length. So it happened really, really fast. That's what happened, but the actual investigation took a lot longer. Number one is that this was not really a whodunit. We knew who did it. We had video and other evidence, but still it took months and months to get everything lined up and ready for trial.
I think people listening, especially those who are not in law enforcement, may not understand exactly why. I mean, you've got the video, you've got him, you've got witnesses. Like on TV, Why can't you just get it into court the next day?
Well, number one, we got the affidavit in court next day for the probable cause arrest, but the probable cause arrest is different than going to trial, as you know very well. The FBI is thorough. We really spent a lot of time talking to people, hunting down potential witnesses, and doing all that work because, as I'm going to get into in a minute, at the start, we didn't know if he was alone or acting alone. And there were several issues we had that indicated he could actually be part of a conspiracy or there could be other people involved. And I think that's where I'll go next. I mentioned that the FBI office was just yards away from the shooting. And this is Friday at 9:30 or 9:20 in the morning. So you'd think that there would be people ready to go and ready to respond quickly. The problem is that no one from the FBI was there. This was the day when our former director, James Comey, was in LA for the first time. And Jerry, you know very well, whenever there's a new FBI director, there's basically a tour where he goes to every field office and visits and meets people. And November 1st, 2013 happened to be the day that Director Comey was in Los Angeles for an all-employee meeting. It was a mandatory meeting. And for all the FBI agents listening to this, we all know that if you don't make a meeting mandatory, no one's showing up. So this was a mandatory meeting, and it was off campus, north of the airport, about 10 miles north of the airport. So everyone was there. Well, almost everyone, because even a mandatory meeting means that 20% don't show up. And I happened to be one of those people that didn't show up for the meeting. I was at home when the shooting happened. It was my day off. I was working a Sunday through Thursday, and this was a Friday morning. And I had put on my running gear. I was about to go for my run. Just before I stepped out of the house, my phone buzzed, and I took a look at it. The airport has basically an alert system, an emergency management system. And the message said that there was shots fired near the Burger King office. The Burger King at that time at Terminal 3 was deep in the terminal. Lollipop reference again at the top of the lollipop in the center. That gave me pause because it's very rare that there's an alert that says that shots were fired in the terminal. So I didn't start my run. I just waited for the next one. And the next one was talking about it was a person was down at Terminal 3 checkpoint. And at that time, I changed out of my running gear and I got in my car and I started heading towards LAX. And then a couple minutes later, all my team members who were listening to Director Comey started to email asking what they should do. And I said, get to the airport as fast as possible. And it was funny because afterwards, a lot of people were saying Director Comey apparently noticed because there was a moment during his speech where everyone started to look at their phones and there was murmuring in the audience and he asked what was going on because everyone was getting these alerts that LAX was essentially under attack. And there was an active shooter there. Going up to the airport, my phone was pretty much blowing up constantly. And I had to have my boss at the time, he's a retired agent now, Greg Bichet. I had asked him to send out an all-employee message saying, don't go to the airport. We'll tell you when we need you. Because otherwise we just couldn't deal with hundreds of emails and text messages coming in all at once. Getting to the airport was also problematic. For anyone who's been to LAX has a lot of gridlock, a lot of traffic. It's hard to get around. And in this case, a few minutes after the shooting, one of the managers at the airport police wasn't sure what was going on, didn't know if we had other shooters, etc., and he shut down the roadways. So you couldn't get in or out of the airport. It's good and bad for a lot of reasons, but it was bad for responders like me because how are you going to get to the airport? Going up that day, there were signs in the freeway saying, LAX is closed, don't come here, which is a little bit disconcerting because LAX sort of prides itself in never closing. So I was going up the 405. I got near the airport, and I've been there a while, so I know all the back roads in. I snuck into a side entrance, and I was going to go on the tarmac and drive on the airfield to get there. And I can remember punching in my code and swiping my badge, and the door didn't open. A woman comes out of the guard booth and says, you can't come in. The airport's closed down. And I shouted back at her, I'm the FBI incident commander. Let me in. And she had to make a couple phone calls to get me approval to sneak in that way. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to get to the airport at all. I showed up at Terminal 3 where the command post was set up. I had parked on the airfield, went through the doors. It was eerily quiet at that time. And I checked in at the command post. We all knew each other. We'd been working together for many years. When I got there, it was a little bit disconcerting because I'm sure you've probably talked in other episodes about the fog of war. When you show up to an incident, a very dynamic incident like this, there's a lot of things you just don't know. When I got there, what I learned was that the TSA officer was the shooter. And I'm like, oh, that's bad. And we've all heard about, employee violence and things like that. So I started to tell my bosses that, hey, the TSA officer is the shooter and several people are down. That's what I've been hearing. And over the course of about 20 minutes or so, I had relayed that information to my contacts at the U.S. Attorney's Office and my team and my bosses. But something didn't quite seem right with the info. And it was a little bit off. And I should probably back up also here. I had a really good team at the time and also really good U.S. Attorney's Office support. This case, in the end, had 4 FBI case agents, and I was one of the 4, but I was not the lead case agent. The lead case agent was Steve Kuberian, who recently retired. And it was Steve and Sharon Marks, who were running it out of Long Beach, and then me and my partner Nina, who's still with the FBI, running it out of LAX. And then on the U.S. Attorney's Office side, we had Melissa Mills, Pat Fitzgerald, and Joanna Curtis, all very, very excellent AUSAs. And so when I first got there, I was feeding information to Melissa in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And I can remember that we were preparing search warrants on the TSA officer, Officer Hernandez, on his home.
Oh, my goodness.
Because we just had this fog of war. We were being told that he was the shooter. And it's like, this doesn't make any sense. The next person to arrive was my partner, Nina. And I told her that I needed her to go to the hospital and figure out what the truth was. And about 30 minutes later, so now we're probably an hour and a half into the shooting, Nina called me and she's like, David, the TSA officer is dead. He's the victim. I'm like, oh. So part of the fog of war is when you start to learn things, that sunlight comes in and you push that fog back. This was a really important first step.
Can you imagine going to his home to search it when his family is being told that he's dead and they're being told that he's the person responsible instead of the victim?
I cannot imagine it. And I'm so glad it didn't happen. Going back to fog of war again, when you get there, you have to have some sort of belief that, okay, this is good info. But as things don't make sense, that's when you take a step back and you say, okay, what's the truth here?
Before you even continue, we may have people listening who may not have listened to the first episode, and they're saying, why was the FBI called in the first place? Let's back up a little bit, can we?
Yeah. Number one, the FBI has jurisdiction for crimes on a plane, but there's also some crimes that happen at the airport that are federal crimes. Think about all the different people working at the airport. There's TSA, who are federal officers. There's Customs and Border Protection. There's DEA. There's a lot of different federal crimes or potential federal crimes that happen at airports.
What about just the local police, the LAPD?
Yeah. So while we are not necessarily the only jurisdiction for some of the crimes at airports, the federal government does have jurisdiction on some matters. And in this case, we had a jurisdictional issue because, number one, we have a murder and multiple attempted murders in Los Angeles, which is jurisdiction of the LAPD. However, the TSA officer is a federal officer who was murdered, and that makes it a federal case. There's also a section of law that's called violence at international airports. And so that makes a violent act in an airport a federal jurisdiction matter. And those are 2 of the first charges we charged Ciancio with. 18 U.S.C. 1114, which was murder of a federal officer, and 18 U.S.C. 37, which is violence at international airports. So there is a joint jurisdiction issue. We saw that come up in the 2002 active shooting at LAX also, where originally it was LAPD jurisdiction, then FBI took over quite a bit later. In this particular instance, even though there was a joint jurisdiction with the murder in the city, but also the murder of a federal officer, as soon as we figured out who the shooter was and who the victim was, it was very obvious this was going to go federal because of the TSA officer, the federal officer being the victim. Even though there was a joint jurisdiction issue, the FBI had the lead from probably about the second hour until the end.
What was the relationship between the FBI at LAX and the LAPD? Because I'm sure they had officers or detectives and sergeants assigned to the airport. Did you know each other? Did you work together on a regular basis before this shooting occurred?
Oh, yes, of course we did. But also, it's a little bit stranger than that because there are 2 local police departments with a footprint at LAX. The first is the LAX Airport Police, and they have their own police chief and chain of command, and they are a completely separate entity from the LAPD. The Los Angeles Police Department has a substation on the other side of the airport at Terminal 8. At the time, they had, I think, about 30 officers, a captain, a lieutenant, and some sergeants. But the airport police has a lot more officers, and it's their jurisdiction. But when there's a big event like this, the LAPD comes, and generally their detectives take over the big events. To answer your specific question, number one, we had two local police departments, but we all knew each other. Something about working at an airport is there's a lot of exercises, tabletops, and field training exercises and meetings to get to know each other and understand the jurisdictions. So everyone in the command post when I showed up, I already knew pretty intimately, not just with the state agencies, but also the federals. We had CBP and DEA task force. We had federal air marshals. HSI was there. There's a lot of different entities. If you don't know the people, you're at a terrible disadvantage. And LAX is very, very good about having those meetings and getting people to know each other before things go bad and know how to communicate with each other. So I was very fortunate to walk into a situation where I was looking at a bunch of friendly faces and we all knew each other from many other incidents in the past. Once we figured out who the shooter was, that was very important information, obviously. The next thing was these other fogs of war, these other issues we had. We had information that there was a shooter on the roof of the parking structure across from Terminal 3. That was problematic for us because our command post was right underneath it. We had a helicopter check it out and determine that was not true. By this time, we have social media blasting out all sorts of crazy things that one of the people shot was the former NSA director, or different people had been injured. So there was a lot of different things we had to work through. We also had issues trying to figure out exactly how many people had been shot and how many people had gone to the hospital. The fire department's command post and the police command post were separate at that time. We had interactions between each other and liaisons, but it took a while to figure out how many people were actually at the hospital. For example, the fire department was very clear that they had taken this school teacher to the hospital. They were very clear that it had taken one of the TSA officers to the hospital. Okay, I knew that. But for about 3 or 4 hours, I was getting these tidbits of information that another TSA officer had been shot. And I didn't know where that came from because the fire department knew nothing about it. And it wasn't until about 4 hours in that we figured out that, Officer Grigsby had been shot in the heel and limped out to the tarmac where he had jumped in the back of a police cruiser. And that police officer had taken him to the hospital, which is why the fire department didn't know about it. So there are all these little things that took a long time to figure out. And I know I'm jumping around a little bit back and forth here.
The jumping around kind of gives us an idea of all of the stuff that's happening, because it's impossible for you to walk into a situation and know everything and get the right information because everybody has a little piece of what happened that day.
That's absolutely correct. And not only that, but everyone is sharing their piece of information all at once. Your phones are blowing up, the emails are blowing up. It's good that everyone wants to be involved, but it also is a little bit bad. We had information overload. We were having meetings about, at the start, I think it was every 30 minutes, where the unified command would get together and we'd talk about what we knew, what we suspected, and what we were trying to get clarity on in the next 30 minutes. And that was really important to push back that fog of war. When I first went through the crime scene, we did a walkthrough of the crime scene. We had obviously where the TSA officer, Officer Hernandez was a crime scene, and we could see bullet casings. So we had a crime scene there with his suitcase with the officer being shot there. We went upstairs to the TSA checkpoint. This was an uncontrolled evacuation. There are mounds of suitcases. Everyone left their stuff and ran. So it looks like a war zone with just things strewn everywhere on the floor, on the checkpoint. It's just suitcases everywhere. So then we have an issue with, what if there's a bomb here? What if there's a secondary device? We don't know if someone planted something. So we have to have dogs run all these things also. When we got to the end of the TSA checkpoint, where Ciancia stopped to fire at the other officers, Grigsby and Spear, we had more bullet casings on the ground. As we walked down the terminal, there were places in the walls where we could see bullets that had grazed or had been shot into the ceiling, so we had that to deal with. As we walked further down on the right-hand side, there was like an airport gift and snack shop. And there was a puddle of blood behind one of the sweatshirt and t-shirt racks. And then across the hall on the left side, there was a duty-free store. And we could see on the ground, as you were walking into the duty-free store, these giant blood stains and dragged. That's where the school teacher had been shot. He had shot him in the leg, breaking a couple bones in his leg. He couldn't run. He had dragged himself on his hands and one good working leg from the hall into the duty-free to hide behind some of the counters in duty-free. But we could see those blood stains as he dragged himself and on the floor. Then we walked down into the lollipop section of the terminal, and we had broken glasses, broken windows, bullet casings where Ciancia was shot. Believe it or not, we had teeth in his pants. When he had been dropped, paramedics actually did some work on him there. So we could see the puddle of blood. We could see a couple teeth on the ground. The gun was still there. Beyond that, some of the shots had gone a little bit wide and had blown out the windows. We could see the tarmac and the runways from where we were looking. So the crime scene had bullet casings all over. We had blood in multiple spots. Imagine having to process a crime scene the size of an entire airport terminal. It's a big deal. Back to our point about the chaos and whatnot. How do you process that scene? It's like, well, one bite at a time, right? As more members of my team got there, the FBI separated and we had a command post set up at a different location because it was so hard to get into the airport. And my bosses went to that command post, and I think it was my ASAC at the time, Viviette Morgan, joined me at LAX. She took over as incident commander. We started the process of figuring out what was going on and what we needed to do. And early on in this process, we had a lot of questions about whether the shooter acted alone. We were going back to video, which, number one, once we figured out who's who in the zoo, we ran all our checks on him, and he didn't have California ID. We couldn't figure out where he was living. We did have like a motorcycle assigned to him, but nothing else. We went back to the video and we saw that he was dropped off at LAX. That gave rise to a number of concerns about who dropped him off. Do we have another shooter or a co-conspirator? How deep does this go? We had to track that down. And I think this is a good place to stop and say something else that was going on behind the scenes that we didn't know was what was going on in Ciancia's mind that day. He was living in LA and he was subletting like a room, which is why he wasn't showing up in anyone's rental contracts. He burst into one of his roommates' room and said, "Hey, I have to go to the airport. Someone's sick in the family. Can you drive me to the airport?" And he had a handwritten piece of paper that had a Virgin America flight on it. And his roommate drove him to the airport. I guess before he had gone to the airport, he had sent one of his family members a text, basically like a goodbye text, which freaked out the family member enough that they had called Ciancia's dad. The family, his father in particular, was known to law enforcement in a good way in terms of they were law enforcement supporters, boosters, upstanding members of the community. And the father had reached out to the local police, who had reached out to the LAPD to do a welfare check on their son, Ciancia, to make sure he was okay. The LAPD officers got to Ciancia's place where he was living too late. He was already on his way to LAX, so they didn't make contact.
Wow.
So we didn't learn about that until many, many hours later, but it was just sort of interesting that that happened. We learned that his roommate had dropped him off and then taken off. Some of the things Ciancia did to show that this was premeditated. Number one is that he had written down this flight itinerary. Number two, Ciancia's assault rifle did not fit into his carry-on bag. You think about like a flight attendant bag or a carry-on bag, something small that fits into the seats, right? So what he did is he took his small carry-on bag. It was a cloth bag, like a vinyl cloth bag with rollers on it. He had cut a hole in the top of it, and he had like a duffel bag that he had cut a hole in the bottom of that and sewed them together so that the duffel bag and his suitcase were stuck together. So when he put his assault rifle in his suitcase, the tip of it was sticking out of the bag, but you couldn't see it because his other bag was hiding it. And he had sewn them together to hide his assault rifle. He had put several shirts in there and a lot of ammo, like 10 or 12 boxes of additional ammo in that suitcase. And that's how he hid his gun, so that his roommate didn't know that there was a gun in the bag also. And then he also wrote a note. We found the note, and I should point out here that the note we have is the only window into his mind. We have never interviewed this guy. And I say that, I think I can get to that a little bit later, but very early in the process, the public defender's office got involved and exerted his right to remain silent. So we never have interviewed Ciancia to this day. But his letter gave us pretty good window into what was going on. In terms of the letter, it wasn't one specific cohesive ideology, but there was a lot of conspiracy theory parts to the letter. He talked about the New World Order. And for viewers who are unfamiliar, the New World Order, or the NWO, to paraphrase, it's basically people think there's like this cabal shadow government, the New World Order. He was a believer of that. He used the phrase fiat currency, like money doesn't have any value except we assign to it. From what we've pieced together, he was very much against the TSA because he believed when the New World Order was going to take over society and take over all governments, that the TSA was a ready-made police force. And so he was going to take out the TSA because he believed that they were going to be part of this New World Order taking away his rights.
Not the FBI, not local PD, not state police, DEA, but the TSA.
That's correct. That's why he targeted TSA officers. In the letter, he also talked about why he started where he started. He said that before the checkpoints is where I can get to, and I want to show you how unsecure and unsafe you are at the start of your checkpoints. And that's why he did what he did. He signed his letter, Paul Ciancia. Again, it's not a whodunit. We knew who did it. And he also used the phrase pissed off patriot. What we saw was he basically was proud of what he was doing, and he believed he was in the right and that this was a good thing for him and a good thing for America. I believe he expected to die and that the letter was not only an explanation, but also a suicide note.
And where was this? Was this on his person or was this left behind at his room?
It was actually in his suitcase he brought to the airport, the one that he had jury-rigged so that his gun would fit, and we found it there.
One of the things that I'm thinking is why Terminal 3? For him to have the ultimate impact, you would have thought he'd go to a terminal such as the terminal where Delta or American Airlines flew out of Southwest, where you would think there'd be even more people and even more TSA agents.
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned that. You said a couple things that really resonate. And one of the things you said, well, why Terminal 3? And one of the things we see, not just here, but across the Bureau and across counterterrorism, whether it's domestic terrorism, international terrorism, is that people surveil their targets in advance. And what we learned from Ciancia was he chose Terminal 3 because he had been through it a few months earlier. A few months before this happened, he had actually flown from LAX back to Philadelphia. That's where most of his family lived. So he was already familiar with the terminal. He was familiar with the flights. There were 2 TSA stickers. I don't know if you remember back in the day, there would be like different colored stickers to be put on your boarding pass or your suitcase or your bag claim when something had been searched. We found 2 of those TSA stickers in like a neon orange. One of them was on his actual assault rifle and one of them was on his letter. And we were able to track those back to the Philadelphia airport. At the time where he traveled for real to visit his family, that was the color they were using. And so my counterpart in Philadelphia confirmed that he had been there and that this is the sticker they were using. So in terms of why Terminal 3, this is his surveillance. He has already been through there. He knows the layout. When he provided the piece of paper to his roommate as proof that he had a flight, he used the flight he had already been on. And we see that over and over with different terrorist events. Ahmed Rassam, the Millennium Bomber from '99, did that. 2002, Hashem Hedayat was familiar with the El Al ticket counter because he had been there in the past. We saw that with JIS in 2005. They had surveilled LAX as a potential terrorist target. Over and over, we see people picking places they're familiar with because they have some idea about it because they've already been there and scoped it out.
Interesting. Very interesting.
I don't want to sound callous here, but we were very fortunate in this incident. This could have been so much worse. Even not super busy, it's still LAX, which means there's a lot of people around. Hundreds and hundreds of people there. He was specifically targeting TSA officers. He walked by so many people in the break room, people running the other direction from him, that he ignored because they weren't TSA. If he did not care, we could have had a mass casualty event like few people have ever seen. The fact is he was specifically targeting one group of people. That saved lives. Sounds terrible, but it's 100% true. And I will also say that I talked at the start of this episode about how after his initial shots, he returned to finish shooting point blank range because he saw Officer Hernandez move. That took us several extra seconds to do. That pause from his movements saved a lot of lives too, because when he had his first burst of shots at Officer Hernandez, everyone in the terminal, you could see from the videos, flinched, who wasn't physically there to see what had happened. Those people ran. But the people upstairs at TSA, you could see all of them flinch and look around. And it took about 3 or 4 seconds until the next round of shots came out. That's when the mass evacuation started, the uncontrolled evacuation. Because the first round, it's like, what was that? A couple people ran because they knew. But it was the second round of shots where everyone said, uh-oh. And that's when they all ran into the terminal. him turning around to stop was terrible, but it also saved a lot of lives in retrospect. There's no other way to say it.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying and not saying as far as the tragic
Yeah.
end to Officer Hernandez. How many
Yeah.
TSA officers were upstairs that, if that had not occurred, would have potentially been in harm's way?
I don't remember. It's a busy terminal. There were a lot of TSA officers there, whether it's 20 or 40 or 50. I'm just not sure right now how many there were, but it was enough that this could have been very, very bad. And I will point out here also, TSA did a really, really good job, not only in this incident, but in their training. They are one of the few agencies that actually practices evacuation training and talks about it. They did what they were supposed to do. They ran away from the threat. Not only did they go away from the threat like their training dictated, they took passengers with them. And that saved lives too. Kudos to the TSA management for making sure that their officers were trained in how to evacuate and where to go. I'm not going to go into too many details because these are ongoing things, but they did a great job in their training and their preparation for this. Kudos to them for also every one of them as they're leaving is taking passengers with them and being a leader to get people to move. And that's, I think, where I want to start talking a little bit about Officers Grigsby and Spear, because what they did was very heroic. When I was watching the videos of this incident, Grigsby and Spear were the last two TSA officers to leave the checkpoint. And it wasn't that they were slow or didn't understand. It's that they stopped to help out the last passenger in the checkpoint area. At this time, we don't know that he's only after TSA officers. All we know is there's been a shooting downstairs, and this is bad. They actually stopped because in a crisis, people react in different ways. There was one passenger who basically froze. And instead of fleeing, he sat there. Then he started to collect his shoes and his belongings. And Grigsby and Spear stopped him, told him to leave everything and just to run. And it took several seconds for them to convince this guy to go with them. That meant that those two officers were the last ones to leave the checkpoint.
These are the two officers that you said that as he's coming down the corridor, he can see that dark blue color of their uniform.
Yeah. As they're running down this probably 50 or 60 yard hallway, that's when Ciancia reached the edge of the TSA area and could see down this long, straight, and narrow hallway and saw those blue uniforms. The only people in that corridor at the time were the two TSA officers, the school teacher, passenger, and this doctor, who was the last one to leave. And Ciancia took aim and he shot Officer Spear in the shoulder, in the back. He shot Grigsby in the foot, and he shot the school teacher in the leg. The doctor, who was the one who was the last one to leave, was not shot at all. Again, people react differently in a crisis. No blame. It is what it is, right? And by the way, we only know that because there's one video camera that captured it, and it wasn't airport police video. At the time, Terminal 3 was the oldest terminal, I believe, at LAX. It was built in the 60s. It was 2013 at the time this happened. The camera coverage in that long hallway was almost non-existent. But there was a currency exchange in the middle of the corridor, and that camera captured Spear, Grigsby, the teacher, and the doctor as they were running. And right at the far end of the camera angle, we could see two of the people get shot and fall out of view of the camera angle. So we know exactly where they were shot and how far down the corridor they had made it. After they were shot, again, Ciancia's got a clear view to them, but that's where he stopped to reload. And during that reloading period, the school teacher went into duty-free, dragged himself into duty-free. Officer Spear went into the newsstand or bookshop or whatever it was and hid behind the clothing rack. And Grigsby limped to the end of the corridor and went down to the tarmac to escape. And the doctor, I have no idea where he went, but I think is just down the corridor and out. That's where they all ended up after the shooting. Once Ciancia was passed and kept jogging into the hallway, Officer Spear, left the safety from behind the coat rack and made his way out and was able to talk to one of the officers and say this is what happened, and gave a description, whatnot, and he got help. Grigsby went to a waiting police car and went to the hospital there. Once the area was safe, the school teacher was evacuated and taken to the hospital. The first police officer into the terminal came in at about just after 2 minutes, about 2 minutes, 10 seconds after the shooting. The officers assigned to the terminal had gone on a brief break. They were not in the terminal at the time. But when the alerts came into the police station, the first officer on scene actually came from the station, which is a couple terminals over. And it took about 2 minutes, and he came running into the terminal, gun drawn. Right behind him was another officer. Then a couple more followed. The four of them had some passengers who had hidden in different places coming out. They all had their hands up. They were giving descriptions to vector the officers in where to go. The officers had pretty good training. The first officer in, it's a man named Steve. He still works for the airport police, so I'll just call him Steve. He was, for a long time, one of the range officers, so he was a good shot and tactically sound. He went down and formed a diamond with the first few officers in the facility. And when they got to that divider at the end of this long hallway, they decided to go right. And I was talking to Steve, and he said, yeah, we heard a noise to the right, so we went to the right. And it was the right decision. That's where Ciancia was. As the terminal opened up, they could see him about 30 yards away. He had his assault rifle in his hand, and the officers opened fire, and they missed him at first. One of the officers strafed from where they were to behind a pillar for some cover and concealment. One of the officers, Steve, went forward to where the airline counters were. That's where the shot took down Ciancia. Shot him in the jaw, a bunch of teeth came blowing out, part of his tongue came out, and that's where things ended.
I'm quiet because picturing that, the chaos, the action, the nerves, the adrenaline is something that you think about when you watch, a TV show or a movie, but this is real life.
It's real life. These guys went down facing God knows what. That's their job, and they did it. So kudos to them. They were heroes that day to stop this.
Absolutely.
I will say something else, too, and that is that it wasn't just the airport police. One thing that a lot of people don't realize is that there's a lot of agencies with law enforcement training and guns at airports. The first few officers to come in, we had CBP officers coming in also. Customs and Border Protection, who, as credit to their agencies, joined in with the airport police and went down and to neutralize the threat. Before the FBI was with U.S. Customs and Customs and Border Protection, there was a Customs and Border Protection officer. I think he was the fifth or sixth officer into the terminal, and he integrated with the airport police and went down to take care of business too. It's not just the airport police doing the right thing here. In terms of the investigation, again, bouncing around a little bit, as you pointed out, there's a lot of chaos, right? There's a lot of things going on. In terms of the investigation, once we figured out what was going on, the FBI shifted into high gear. And I guess there's no real other way to put it. As you are familiar with, if you have the biggest case in the Bureau will move heaven and earth to get things done immediately. That's what happened here. Every roadblock went away. Every piece of paper was not required. Everything happened. Every resource in the Bureau's massive arsenal was available to us, and we took advantage. My boss was at the command post trying to figure out who this guy was and whether other people were involved, and working with the U.S. Attorney's Office to get search warrants on the right house and the right people, and figuring out where this guy had been. Within a few hours, we had figured out where he had lived in New Jersey. We figured out that he had been going to, I think it was a motorcycle mechanic school in Florida. We knew what house he had been living in Los Angeles. And the U.S. Attorney's Office, that was at the time, again, Melissa and Patrick and Joanna, were working on search warrants for all those locations. We were sending people to Florida to interview the mechanics school. We were sending people to his home where his parents lived in New Jersey. So while this happened at LAX, it became a national investigation very, very quickly. Obviously, or maybe not obviously, one of the things we had to do in a hurry was figure out if we had more people involved. His roommates were cooperative. They told us what was going on. I don't remember if there was a consent search or if we waited for a search warrant, but either way, we had things searched and seized pretty quickly. We had a lot of cooperation from a lot of people. And I will also point out here that I don't speak for the family, obviously, and I've never spoken to them. But I know in talking to my colleagues in this that they were torn at the start. I mean, Dad is a law enforcement supporter. His son has just done this. They were cooperative at the start and gave us a lot of good information. But at the end of the day, it's still their son. When you think about these types of things, you're doing damage to not only everyone at LAX and obviously a lost life, but the family also. They had no idea what this was about to happen. And I know that it was really emotional and difficult for that family too. I mentioned earlier that there were 4 FBI case agents, and I will admit that when my boss gave it to Steve to be the lead on, I was a little bit cranky about that because, it's LAX is mine. But in reality, it was absolutely the right case and the right thing to do. I had opened a couple pretty large cases about 2 months earlier, and this case needed 4 case agents. Steve was the lead case agent and putting everything together, working with the U.S. Attorney's Office. He was the quarterback, as you will. And then Sharon was the one who made us administratively pure. Search warrants and subpoenas and scheduling and making sure that we were ready to go to trial. And then Nina and I covered LAX. Anything that we needed at the airport, we got. One of the reasons I was really glad it was set up that way is that while this is going on, a couple hours in, I got a text message from an agent saying, hey, I know you're busy, but don't forget, we have this op tomorrow that we need your help on. The airport life never stops. That's a perfect example of it, where we shut down this airport and it's one of the biggest cases in the Bureau at that moment in time. And I'm getting like, hey, don't forget my case tomorrow. At the end of the day, I think we did about 400 to 500 interviews. I know you had a question about that earlier. Why are we doing these things? It's because we're trying to get as much information as possible to make sure we're not surprised and make sure we didn't miss anything. Sort of to your question, I can remember about 2 weeks in, we had done a lot of interviews of TSA officers and airport police and some of the passengers. And I got an email or maybe a phone call from the Virgin America corporate security manager, a guy named Mark Vorzimer. He's long retired. And he's like, hey, you need to talk to this captain of ours. Because at the time, we thought that Cianci had gone down the pathway and then gone to the right where the police found him. In reality, he had not. He had gone to the left and then made his way to the right. We talked to a Virgin America captain whose flight was about to take off when this happened. People came running on, and this captain left the plane because he's like, what's going on out here? And he walked out, and he saw Ciancia from the distance with the assault rifle, and then he went running back to his plane. And based on where that plane was stationed, what gate they were at, it changed our timeline of events, and it changed the path that we thought Ciancia had been on. Now we had better eyewitness views that he went to the left first and not to the right first. Doing those interviews over and over, we were really solidifying exactly what happened, what people saw, and his exact path and trajectory. Yeah, it took a long time. We had to interview a lot of TSA officers too. Oh, here's something to throw at you. So we talked about the evacuation and how it's basically an uncontrolled evacuation into the terminal. From an airport security perspective, these are people now who haven't been screened. We have a mess, and people are running out onto the airport tarmac. Some of those people were running towards the active runways. And what we learned was that one of the landing pilots, the plane's landing, the captain of the plane is calling the tower and says, hey, I don't know if you're aware, but there's about 100 people running towards the runway right now. The air traffic controllers are looking down saying, oh, crap. They're busy trying to land planes. And one of the captain's like, hey, there's people out here about to hit the runway. Obviously, that caused an air traffic control mess. So those 2 runways are shut down. Some of the passengers had run from Terminal 3 to the next terminal over, which is Terminal 2. That caused an evacuation from Terminal 2. And those people ran from 2 to 1. So now we don't have 1 terminal that's dumped. We have 3 terminals that are dumped and people evacuating like crazy. From an investigative perspective, we get there, there's a command post, we figure out who the shooter is, what's going on. We start to piece together how we're going to do this investigation. I mentioned early on that it was going to be an FBI-led incident early on, but that didn't mean we didn't have partners. We could not have done this without our partners. One of our partners obviously was TSA and the Federal Air Marshals. One of our team members was Don McMullen, who was really key at getting important video to us so we could see how Ciancia got to the airport and what his path was. When it was time to do the interviews, we needed about 100 agents. And I mentioned early that I asked my boss to put out an all-employee message saying, don't come to the airport unless we tell you to come. That turned out to be very, very important because over the first couple hours, we figured out what we needed. And about, maybe an hour and a half in, we had figured out what was going on. We were starting to put things together. The fog of war was lifting, and we're getting into this next stage of investigation. And one of the officers came over to me and said, hey, we have these 15 witnesses here. And you pointed to 15 passengers. Do you want to interview them? I wasn't really thinking right because I thought, yeah, of course we want to interview them. I had a bunch of my team and some of the HSI people who were there join us, and they went up to my office and started doing interviews. What I did not understand is that there should be a lot more than 15 people to interview if we just dumped an entire terminal. Because about 20 minutes after those interviews started, another officer came over to me and said, hey, we have about 300 people who self-evacuated onto the tarmac, and we've rounded them up and put them on buses. What do you want to do with them? And I'm like, they're not going to fit in my office. I don't know. That's when we started to work with the airport on what to do with these people, because we still had concerns about whether he was acting alone. Do we have another shooter in the midst or a co-conspirator in the midst? What did people see? There's a lot of questions. So we couldn't just let everyone go at that moment in time.
And where were they going to go anyway? Because most of these people were trying to go out of town, and the airport right now, I take it, it's still not flying planes out of Terminal 3.
I think the airport as a whole was shut down for several hours. So nothing was flying out. And also, we had shut down the road, so no one could even get there. It was a passenger disaster. If you were traveling that day, I guarantee you remember this. What we did is the airport operations had a bunch of passenger buses. They put everyone in buses, and we had a massive holding area at the Tom Bradley International Terminal. It fit about 500 people. And so we just put them all there. We had officers at the different exits to keep them there. There was water, there were toilets. So we could house them there for a little bit of time that gave us the ability to get our act together. And one of the things we asked for in a hurry was we needed about 100 agents from the FBI's rapid deployment team to get here immediately. And we didn't have them come to the airport. We had them come like off the airport for a staging area and then come in as a group. And because it was still inside the city of Los Angeles, and because LAPD is a very, very good partner, we had every interview at that time. It was LAPD and FBI married up with each other doing the interviews. And so that's how we started to do those interviews and get those passengers and employees cleared. At the same time, what do you do with our law enforcement officers who are first down, who actually engaged the subject? There's a lot of protections for officers involved in an officer-involved shooting. And it wasn't until maybe 8 p.m. that night that we started the interviews of the officers, the first 4 that had went down and had fired their weapons. I was the FBI agent who sat in on those. LAPD's shooting team led the interview, and they have a process and a procedure for any officer-involved shooting. Like the FBI, I took my own notes, and then I had a bunch of my own questions that I asked. And about midnight or 1 in the morning, we were done, and we went back to the terminal. By this time, it's 1 in the morning. I should point out also that I talked about the FBI moving heaven and earth to get things done when it mattered. In this particular instance, the FBI called in ERT, evidence response teams, not only from the FBI's Los Angeles division, which has a big and robust ERT, but they called them in from Sacramento, San Diego, Vegas, I think San Francisco, to come down because, number one, the entire Terminal 3 was a crime scene, and that's a big scene. They broke it up into quadrants. But also, we were collecting clothing from the different people who were shot, obviously from Officer Hernandez. We had Officer Grigsby, which, by the way, we had to go to his house because he had gone home after being treated. We had to get Officer Spears things. We had the school teachers things. We also had to send teams with agents to the home where he lived in LA and execute search warrants at that crime scene. Then we had teams in Florida and in New Jersey where he used to live and where family members were. We had so many ERT teams processing different scenes that when I talk about the FBI moving heaven and earth, it really was no expense spared to get people where they needed to be to get this done as soon as possible. Here's our timeline. This happened about 9:20 in the morning. At about 2 p.m., we allowed employees back into everywhere except Terminal 3 to get ready to start the job again. At 4 p.m. the same day, we reopened every screening location at the airport except for Terminal 3. We got the roads open that night about 7 p.m., and FBI's ERT worked throughout the night. And at 8 a.m., so 23 hours after the shooting happened, at 8 in the morning on November 2nd, we turned the terminal back over to airport operations. So they got a lot done in a short amount of time.
Wow, yeah, less than 24 hours.
Yeah, and at 1 p.m. the next day, the airport opened up Terminal 3 because once we gave it back to them, there's still blood on the ground, there's bullet holes, there's broken glass. So it took them a few extra hours to get it open to the public. And it's interesting because while they cleaned up the terminal, they missed a few bullet holes. And for the next few months, as I took people around, people wanted tours of what happened and where it happened. I'd point out different bullet holes that maintenance had missed. And I think they were there for about a year before they finally got to the last one. And in the meantime, much to his credit, the TSA administrator at the time, do you remember John Pistol?
Oh, yeah. I've interviewed him on the podcast.
Well, when he retired from the FBI, he became the TSA administrator. I had been at the airport until about 1 or 2 in the morning because after we were done with the officers, I went back to the terminal. We did another walk through the crime scene, talked about some things, and we talked about the next day. And the next day, we had to be back at LAX, I think, at about 8 a.m. because TSA Administrator Pistol flew in to get a personal briefing and tour and to take care of his people and his team because this is an unspeakable tragedy to the TSA's team at LAX. Being who he is, he had some very pointed and good questions. He took a lot in during the walkthrough, so he was deeply involved and engaged when this happened.
I can only imagine because it is an agency, like you said, that this is their first incident where an officer was killed in the line of duty. We've had that happen. I've been to 3 of those funerals myself for the FBI, and I just can't imagine the tragedy of it all.
Yeah. I will say also that to this day, every terminal at LAX and most offices have a picture of Officer Hernandez. And I believe that his picture is throughout TSA's offices across the country. I don't know how many there are in, but I know that TSA as an agency respects his memory and reveres his sacrifice. From an investigation side of the house, the day after this happened, Steve, the lead case agent, swore out the warrant for Ciancia's arrest, who, by the way, was sent to the UCLA hospital. It's a teaching hospital, and they nursed him back to health slowly. But Steve and I were the 2 officers who served him with his arrest warrant. At the time, he was being guarded 24/7. He was handcuffed to the bed, and we gave him his warrant for murder and for violence at an international airport. And over the next couple of weeks, he got slightly better. Eventually, he was transferred from the hospital to a medical jail ward out in San Bernardino, California. A couple things happened during his hospital stay. I mentioned that we never talked to him. Number one, part of his face and tongue were shot out. But number two, the public defender's office moved in a hurry and got in front of a judge to get appointed as counsel. And as soon as they were appointed, they told the U.S. Attorney's Office, don't speak to him. We're invoking his rights. It's okay, fine. So we never talked to him, but we did do a subpoena, maybe a search warrant, I don't remember, for some of the notes that he wrote because he couldn't talk. So when the nurses would ask him questions, he would respond. And most of them were very mundane, but sometimes he would write something very incriminating on a piece of paper. And we were able to get all those notes. And again, this really wasn't a whodunit. We had video and his own statement that he signed. But, we're the FBI, so we're getting every piece of evidence and we're interviewing all those extra people to make sure we missed nothing. And then about, 3 months in, I can remember sitting there and Nina and I were at work and we got a bill from UCLA because Ciancia was in custody. He wasn't going to pay for anything. And we got a bill from UCLA for his medical treatment.
You gotta be kidding. Why would they think that that would be the Bureau's responsibility?
Well, we were in charge of the investigation, but Jerry, I don't know if you've ever opened a bill like that and seen like a $300,000 bill for one of your subjects, and you're just staring at it going, well, I guess we're going to have a bake sale because I don't have that kind of cash.
My goodness. There's got to be some other fund that pays for medical bills.
Well, what happened in this one is I called the Bureau of Prisons. I said, hey, this is who I am. This is going on. And they said, well, has he been indicted? And I said, yes, he was indicted on day 1. They said, well, if he's been indicted, it's our problem. Send it to us. And that was like a victory moment. I got rid of that bill immediately. I never know what happened to it, whether we paid it or not. But man, that's a big bill. So that happened. We went through this large investigation. We did hundreds of interviews, many search warrants, many subpoenas. Sharon and Steve working in Long Beach, me and Nina working at LAX. I really have to tip my hat to Steve and the work he did, and to Sharon and to Nina. I also have to tip my hat to the U.S. Attorney's Office and all the work they did. Early on, there was a decision made that this would be a death penalty case, which does not happen a lot. And so I know they brought in a few other attorneys from Maine Justice, and we were working that way for quite a while. Some things happened as things happen. And at the end of the day, there was a plea agreement in this case. And I went to the sentencing on that. The plea agreement is basically, we take death penalty off the table and he gets a very severe sentence. I was there at sentencing. It was almost 3 years to the day after this happened. It was November 7th, 2016. And if you'll recall, this happened on November 1st, 2013. So 3 years and 6 days later, he was sentenced. The sentencing was disgusting. It was terrible. It was great, don't get me wrong, but he was allowed to make a statement. He apologized to the school teacher, but he did not apologize to the family of Officer Hernandez. There was still a defiance.
So this conspiracy theory with TSA and
Continued.
oh, wow. You would think
Yeah.
after 3 years of being behind bars for this and having time to think about it, he would have been enlightened.
And that's why I say it was just vile and it was reprehensible. I was really glad when our school teacher stood up to give his victim impact statement and he made a comment directly to Ciancia about you should be apologizing to the TSA widow. You should be apologizing to them. And so he took part of his statement to address Ciancia's comments and to put him in his place. I always had respect for the school teacher. I think it was Steve and I who interviewed him in his hospital bed, a man with a tremendous amount of courage. He really showed it during sentencing, too, and saying what needed to be said. Ciancia was sentenced to life in prison plus 60 years. And the reason for that is if there's ever a time where someone says, well, this is how long a life sentence is, it doesn't matter. He's still got 60 years on top of it. I don't think he'll ever see the light of day. And he was a young man. He will probably be in prison until long after you and I have passed.
Excellent. Well deserved.
Yeah. That, I think, is the LAX shooting from 2013. I know I skipped a lot of things. To your point, there was a lot of chaos involved in this. It took a while to get through the fog of war. One thing I will mention is that it led to a lot of changes. At the time, the police and the fire command posts were separate. Those got integrated. There was a lot more communication between police and fire, between TSA and the airport police with better communications. There was a big after-action report, which is probably online, and it was done pretty quickly. The FBI did not participate in that because we couldn't. We were involved in prosecuting this case and investigating it, and we didn't really want to be a part of the after-action report because it could come back to haunt you during cross-examination. But there is an after-action report that was done. I believe it's out there online somewhere.
I'll see if I can find it, and if I can, I'll link it in the show notes. I'm thinking about this as you were going through and reviewing this case, about what could have been done. I mean, he would have done what he initially set out to do. There is no way anyone would be able to know that he had his assault weapon in his bag. They would have not known that. There was no way for anybody to stop him from initially pulling that out and taking that horrific first shot at Hernandez. But it sounds like, and again, I don't want to sound like I'm putting out blame, but it sounds like if there were police officers assigned to the airport and they were not taking their break at that time, they may have been able to stop him before he went up that escalator. But it doesn't sound like the initial stuff, no one would have been able to know and to stop that.
This is an ongoing debate, not just at LAX, but across the country. Resources are limited. Where do you put the officers assigned to your terminals? There was a time that the officers were always at the checkpoint in like a booth. But then there was another train of thought that said, well, if you're always in the checkpoint, people know where you are and they can take you out first. It's like, well, is it better to have foot patrols through the terminal so you're checking on different things? There's no right or wrong answer, I don't think. Sometimes you get lucky, sometimes you don't get lucky. In this case, it just happened that the officers were on break at the time, and this happened. Based on what airport you go to, you'll see different things. And it does vary airport to airport. Even at LAX, it's varied over the years. Things change. But there's also been talk about, well, if we consolidate all the ticket counters like off campus, out of the airport, like a mile or two out of the airport, then bus them in or send them in by train, you can get rid of that here. It's like, yeah, but you've pushed the problem out to a larger facility with more people in it. There's always going to be a place that's before the checkpoint. And that's what most society is, before the checkpoint. And Ciancia made it clear in his note. He said, I want you to know how easy it is to take a weapon to the front of your checkpoints. That also happened in 2002. The prior LAX active shooter had a gun. There's actually 2 Glock handguns, and he was standing in line at the El Al ticket counter at the Tom Bradley terminal. Again, it was before the checkpoints, and he opened fire. In terms of what we can do about it, that is a hard question to answer. It really is. One thing they did at LAX after the 2002 shooting is they had the airport police SWAT team, it's called ESU, stationed in front of El Al every single day. They've been there every day since 2002 for added security. Not every airline or terminal has the resources to do that. Resources are limited, but it's a difficult question and it's a hard question to answer.
And I think it's a question that we're talking about an airport where there's lots of security. As you mentioned, all of these different law enforcement and security agencies that are there. But it really is the same question that you ask when you go to the grocery store or when you go shopping or when you're at church. It happened at an airport, but these are things that are happening when you're celebrating New Year's Eve. It's just it's all around us, and it's sad.
It's so sad that you're right. But yeah, that's exactly correct. Something happened a couple years later. It's the Zorro incident. It was a Sunday night, maybe 6 or 7 p.m. I was at dinner with my family at the time. We were at a place down the street, and my phone blew up and said, there's shots fired at Terminal 7. And I'm like, that's not good. So we basically stopped dinner, and I told everyone to pile in the car. We were all in one car, family event. As we're getting into the car, my phone then blows up. Shots fired Terminal 6, shots fired Terminal 3, shots fired Terminal 1. That's bad. So it looks like we have multiple active shooters targeting the airport. I race home. I have to change outfits and get in my work car and zip up to the airport. Again, it's a nightmare to get there. And my bosses are all again reaching out. It's like, hey, should we be coming? Originally, I said yes. And then as more information was coming in, if there's all these active shooters, there's shots fired at all these terminals, I should be getting better information about 20 minutes in, 30 minutes as I'm driving up. I should be getting better info about how many victims there are and how many shooters there are and what's going on. But I wasn't. And I had a couple of FBI agents who had flown in from different places who were stuck in the turmoil. And they knew me because, LAX and LA. And they were texting me saying, hey, I'm at Terminal 5. Do you know what's going on? I was using them as my eyes and ears saying, no, there's supposed to be an active shooter where you are. What do you see? I'm like, we don't see anything. Eventually, when my SAC, my special agent in charge, called, he's like, I'm going to get in my car and go there. And I said, you know what? Don't. Something is wrong with the information we're getting. It is much different from the active shooter we talked about earlier today. There's something different about this. We should be getting better information.
Where is the information that you're getting coming from?
It's coming from the official LAX. It's called an Everbridge account. It's basically like your one-stop shopping for information. One of the things LAX implemented years ago was to make sure that good communication, people getting information as soon as possible. And so we're getting information right from the airport. And they're getting it right from either airport police or TSA, sources that are legitimate sources. And so by the time I got to the command post, it's like, well, we had sort of figured out that there weren't any active shooters at all. But then it was like, what happened? How did we get here? And I can remember the police chief at the command post walking up to me shortly after I arrived. It was David Maggard. He's retired, has another job now. And he comes up to me and he's like, okay, so there is no active shooter, but we need to know why we're all here and what happened. And he gives me a look like, this is your problem to figure out. I'm like, okay. By this time, by the way, FBI SWAT had deployed to the airport and a lot of other officers and agents were there. I had told my SAC, don't show up. There's something wrong here. And we had figured out, okay, this appears to not be real. Once we figured out it wasn't real, one of the things that I had my people do is we went to the dispatchers and we said, who made the first call that there was an active shooter? And it turned out it was one of the employees over at Terminal 7. And we hunted that person down and interviewed them. It's like, why did you say that? What did you see? And we got that information. It's like, okay, well, and the person's like, yeah, I heard loud noises. I saw everyone running and I erred on the side of caution and said, we have an active shooter. Okay, fair. He, by the way, had been getting that from other people. As people were running by him, they were saying, there's a shooter over here. Oh my God. And so he reported that. Great. Basically, when we got there, we learned that the first caller called the airport police to report an active shooter because there was a stampede of 30 or 40 people coming his way, and they were saying there was an active shooter. When all was said and done, what happened was he reports it to the airport police. What he does then is he joins them and he keeps running. And he's upstairs at this time and he runs over to TSA. There's a TSA supervisor who says, hey, what's going on? And he reports what he has heard, which is there's an active shooter downstairs. Oh my God. She looks around and asks someone else, gets the same answer. So she calls it in to TSA's command center at LAX. Command center then, like, okay, that's important information. And one of the things we did differently from the last active shooter to the Zorro incident is we had better operability and communications between TSA and the airport police. This TSA supervisor who got the information and reported it really did what she thought was right and probably was right. And that is she got on the different frequencies, turning the walkie-talkie from Terminal 7's frequency to Terminal 6, making sure every terminal knew that there was an active shooter. The problem is that she didn't say there's an active shooter at Terminal 7. She said there's an active shooter, and it was on their own frequency. These other terminals are punching into the command post, we have an active shooter at Terminal 1 and Terminal 4, which is why I'm getting these emails saying we have multiple active shooters at multiple terminals. That's where the information came from.
All right, well, something is going on at Terminal 7.
Something was going on at Terminal 7. And
Okay.
that was the next step, because as we're pushing back in time to figure out, okay, well, the stampede started. Why did the stampede start? Many of your viewers may be familiar with Hollywood Boulevard in Los Angeles or Times Square in New York, where there's people in character. There's Elmos and whatever. And in Hollywood at the time, there was a man who dressed up as Zorro. He called himself Black Zorro. It was a black male dressed up as Zorro. And he would take pictures with vacationers, I think $5 or $10 per picture. And that night this happened, he finished his job on Hollywood Boulevard, dressed as full Zorro, and he had taken a shuttle bus to the airport. As he described it later, he was going to the airport to pick up his quote-unquote lady friend, and that happened to be at Terminal 6 or Terminal 7. So he's at Terminal 7, and he is waiting for his quote-unquote lady friend to get off the plane. So he's downstairs. LAX has an upper and a lower level. And he uses the toilet. And he goes into the use the toilet. And the Zorro costume, if anyone's familiar with Zorro, includes a sword. And so now we have a man dressed up with a mask on and a sword in his hand, using the toilet. And one of the people in the restroom calls into the airport police and says, there's a dude here in a mask and a sword, and we don't know what to do with this guy. And so the airport police comes hot and heavy, racing to Terminal 7, thinking the worst, right? They end up coming at him pretty hard, guns drawn, shouting at him. One of the officers is a canine officer. There's a dog barking, and they prone him out. Guns drawn, they demand him to get down on his knees and whatnot. There are some videos online of this. If you separate part of Terminal 7 where one of the videos is filmed, you can see the officers with their guns out. You can see the man dressed as Zorro going down to get handcuffed. And those people on one side are sort of filming it and sitting there. And on the other side, that's where the stampede started. There's a couple of suitcases that fell, leading to loud noises, which people thought were shots. Behind the officers' backs, as they're shouting at Zorro to get down, the people are running. They're running into the terminal and upstairs. As they run upstairs, they're telling this airport worker, hey, there's shots fired downstairs, and he's calling it in. He's running with them to TSA, and then she calls it in. It's like this cascade of phone tag. The officers who are proning out Zorro have no idea what has happened because of what they have done. And about a minute and a half later, they're getting calls on the radio saying there's an active shooter upstairs. They basically leave Zorro in custody of one person, and they go running upstairs to deal with the active shooter, not realizing that they're the ones who caused the mess.
Well, I can tell you that while you were talking, I searched for it and found it. So I'll put a link to the video, because you're right. He was just initially just kind of sitting at the bench, kind of waiting for his lady friend. And yeah, things didn't go well after that for him.
Where the video was shot from, that's the side that didn't really do anything. They just sat and watched. And the other side is the one where the stampede started. That was the mess we walked into. Once the police chief told me, hey, figure out what happened here, I'm like, that's a legitimate and righteous use of my time and mission. I sent out a bunch of my agents and a couple of the people who were there to see if we could find the people who made the phone calls, the TSA officer, the airport employee. And once we figured out what had happened, we hunted down Zorro, and we found him. I got a phone call maybe an hour later saying, hey, we found Zorro. I was like, okay, I'll be right there. It was me and a retired agent named Teresa Papuyo. Excellent agent, by the way, just an excellent person. And she and I went over and found him and explained who we are. And he's like, am I in trouble? And I thought about it. Remember, the airport is fighting mad right now. They've shut down the airport. Flights are delayed. Everyone is mad. And I'm like, I don't think so from a federal perspective, but I'm not really sure, to be honest with you. There's a lot of people mad. I said, from a federal perspective, I just want to know what happened. And so he told me the story, as I was saying, of what he does for a living. But he wasn't dressed as Zorro. He was just dressed normally, because I guess he had figured out that maybe dressed as Zorro with a sword was a bad idea at an airport. And I said, well, where's your costume? And he pointed to it. And I asked him, would you put it on for me, please, so I can see what you look like? And he did. And so I took a couple pictures of it. We figured out what had happened. And then about 1 a.m, we finally debriefed with the airport police chief and his staff. And we explained what had happened. And I can remember the look of incredulity as he shook his head. It's like, you got to be kidding me. And this is a perfect example of the world of Hollywood and make-believe clashing violently with the world of high security. An airport is a high security area where we don't really like it where people are wearing masks and carrying swords. So the two cultures clashed and went very badly. True to my word, there were no federal charges. I don't think there were any charges at all. I mean, I'm not sure what you charge the guy with. He didn't have the intent to really do harm. He just didn't get that he was walking into a high security area and maybe the way he was dressed would cause concern or comment. It was a very interesting incident, though. It happened right after a similar incident happened at JFK, where there was a loud noise and JFK had evacuated due to like a Usain Bolt victory. It was near the Summer Olympics time. And so I was getting calls like, hey, do you think these two are connected somehow? I'm like, I don't think so. Nah. But that's the story of Zorro. It does have some connection to the Ciancia incident in terms of the better communication between TSA and the airport police and interoperability with the different terminals at LAX. Again, missing a couple words in the statement probably made a big difference. But what the officer did at that time was she was trying to do the right thing and communicate what she knew as fast as possible. So kudos to her. She had only added 2 words to her comments, or 3 words, at Terminal 7.
Yeah, and it's good that we can laugh about it. So today,
A little bit, yeah.
yeah, laugh a little bit about it today. But the idea that what they say is true, to be vigilant, and if you see something, say something.
Yeah, and also don't bring masks and swords to the airport.
Yeah, that too.
But we make a little bit of light now, but at the time it was exceptionally serious. It was difficult to figure out. We figured it out. And the first thing we talked about today with Officer Hernandez, that's no laughing matter at all. That to this day remains a very solemn and important event. It's a tragedy.
It certainly is. And so, why don't we take the time to give some safety tips to everyone listening? You know about these incidents. They're at the airport. We know what not to bring and what not to have with us, especially a Zorro costume. But if they hear something, what do you want passengers at the airport to do if they think they're in a situation where there could be some type of a shooting incident? What should they do?
Follow instructions. In this case, the TSA was excellent at helping herd people away from the danger. Listen to not only the TSA officers, but airport police, CBP in their own area, TSA in their area. They are trained to deal with things. They are the best people to listen to and to follow in an incident. Keep in mind that they have a difficult job to do, so try to keep the mouthing off like some people like to do to a minimum. They're just trying to do their jobs, and they're trying to keep people safe. Give the TSA officers and the CBP officers some slack and follow their instructions. That keeps people safe at the airport.
Thank you for that. The last time we talked, you were able to answer my usual questions of when and why you joined the FBI. So anybody who wants to learn about your origin story can go back and listen to episode 340 for that. But I do want to remind everyone that you are a recent retiree. You retired just last year in 2024. I know that you've gotten a new job that you're not ready to share with everyone yet. All I can say is that you started your career at LAX. You spent most of your FBI career at LAX, and your new job is going to take you right back there again. I do want to tell you congratulations on finding a soft place to land post FBI, and to wish you the very, very best in your post FBI career.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that. There's life after the Bureau for sure, and I've been very fortunate to start that new life now.
Very good. And if anybody's curious as to what that is, then I'll just advise them, since we're being kind of cryptic, to check you out on LinkedIn and wait until you update your profile. How's that?
That's fair.
Every time I have a guest on, even those who come back for a second, third, fourth, and maybe fifth time, is to give them the last word. So what would you like to say?
I would like to thank the people, specifically at LAX, for the great teamwork and camaraderie, especially when we're talking about what we talked about today. it wasn't just, okay, the FBI is taking over or this happened to TSA. It was a team effort. Airport police, airport operations, HSI, CBP, TSA, Federal Air Marshals, LAPD, several other agencies too. There wasn't a, I'm in charge, you're in charge. It was a team environment where we're all working together. So I just want to give a shout out to the people there, the mindset and the attitude that they brought to the job about we're trying to work as a team and as a whole for airport security. My hat's off to the people who are at LAX right now doing the Lord's work every single day.
And that's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of retired agent David Gates, a little longer bio for him, and links to articles, after-action reports, and images related to the airport active shooter case and the Zorro incident at LAX. There's also a link to a memorial post for Officer Hernandez on the TSA website, as well as an FBI retired case file review episode featuring safety tips regarding active shooter incidents. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Retired Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 70 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Retired Case File Review with Jerry Williams. Thank you.